Hello everyone, this is Andy from Med School EU, and in today's lecture we're going to continue covering the cell as the basis of life, and the topic of today's video will be prokaryotic eukaryotic cells, and we're going to further break those down into animal and plant cells. Let's get started. So the first thing we will discuss is cell type classification. So there are two fundamentally different types of cells. There are prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And first, let's decipher which one is which and how they're classified. So first, we've got the prokaryotic cells, and that's a group of organisms that lack a nucleus. So all types of organisms, multicellular, unicellular organisms, they're all thrown into this one category of prokaryotic cells that lack a nucleus. So all cells who do not have a membrane around their genetic material would be considered a prokaryotic cell. And typically, not all eukaryotes are multicellular. However, all prokaryotes are unicellular structures. So they're organisms that exist as one single cell, and they would be labeled as prokaryotic cells. And the most typical example that we would have is bacteria. So a lot of bacteria are prokaryotic cells because they are unicellular. They are one single cell organisms. And there are eukaryotic cells that can also be unicellular. However, there are no prokaryotic cells that could be multicellular. And the most typical example of a prokaryotic cell that we could show is a bacteria, and this is actually an E. coli bacteria under the light microscope. So E. coli, and I'm sure you're familiar with the name. And as you can see, these bacteria, they exist as organisms in just one unicellular single cell, and these single cells do not have those little nucleuses. They just kind of have their chromosome, their prokaryotic chromosome, floating around in the center, usually in the middle of the cell. They do not have any sort of membrane to surround it, and therefore they're called prokaryotic cells. Now, if we're looking at the other side of the spectrum, we have eukaryotic cells, and that's a group of cells that have DNA and genetic material that is contained within a membrane. And we call this membrane a nucleus. And like I mentioned earlier, eukaryotic cells could be multicellular, but they could also be unicellular, unlike prokaryotic cells that can only be unicellular. Now, if we take a look at some of the common examples we have here, this is an animal cell, and that's a plant cell. So these are organisms that are multicellular. We know that animals and plants are multicellular organisms. And as you can see here, this is under the microscope. We can clearly see another membrane within that cell. And in this animal cell, that's a nucleus. That's the nucleus. And this is the structure that defines this cell to be a eukaryotic cell versus the prokaryotic cell. And same thing with this one here. We've got plenty of structures. Now, this large one is likely to be a central vacuole because, as we know, plant cells have very big structures called central vacuoles that are used for storage, but they also have nucleus structures. So this could be a nucleus structure right here. We would label that as nucleus. And that's a plant cell. And that's the animal cell. So that's the classification. That's the basic breakdown. There's two types of cells, prokaryotic, eukaryotic cells, and every cell in any type of organism that exists in nature fall under these two categories, prokaryotic or eukaryotic. So moving on with our topic, I wanted to kind of bring everything together and classify all types of cells, and define all the basic features of all cells. What are the common features and all the common components of cells that exist in every type of organism? So first, we have the plasma membrane. And as you know, every cell must be surrounded by some sort of membrane in order to keep all the things inside. And typically the structure of the plasma membrane is made up of phospholipids. As you can see, these little phospholipid heads and tails right here, they're all connected and they form this fluid bilayer membrane. And it is this membrane, the purpose of it is to keep away the extracellular fluid and to contain the intracellular fluid. And what they do is a lot of these proteins, they're embedded with these conjugated proteins and integral proteins and various sugar molecules that are on this plasma membrane. But what their function is to transport nutrients out of the cell, and nutrients would go into the cell from the extracellular fluid. But what controls this movement is the plasma membrane, because it's basically a border. It is a border between the extracellular fluid and other cells. They could be close to nearby other cells. And it basically controls the movement in and out of the cell, which is extremely important. And no single cell cannot exist without this plasma membrane structure. And next, of course, we have the genetic material. And here I've got an example of a DNA double helix, but genetic material in a cell could be DNA that has single strands, double-stranded DNA. It could be RNA, which is single-stranded or double-stranded. So various viruses could have all kinds of RNA and DNA structures within them. However, here in this example, we have a DNA structure. As you can see, it's a double helix that has a complementary base pairing connected right in the middle here. And it's covered with the sugar phosphate backbone. And this is just the general depiction of a genetic material. And the basic feature of all cells is they must contain some sort of genetic material, whether they're prokaryotic or eukaryotic. They need genetic material in order to make proteins, in order to make certain structures in the cell. That all needs to be coded by this genetic structure, either in DNA or RNA format. Next, we're going to discuss this structure right here is called the cytoplasm. And typically all parts of the cell between the plasma membrane, as we talked about here, and the central region, so the nucleus, would make up the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm is basically this material that is inside the cell and is just the cell's medium to contain all the organelles and to contain all the cytosol and the cytoskeleton. So we can label this here as the cytoplasm. And I'm just pointing into the direction of inside the cell. I mean, this could be pointing to a ribosome or another structure. However, I am simply pointing towards the middle of the cell because the cytoplasm surrounds all structures of the cell. It is basically just the filling of the cell, because the cell cannot be hollow. It cannot be empty with just the organelles floating around. It's got to be in some sort of medium to protect things and to form a structure that would complement the cell's functions. And another feature that we must discuss is that the cytoplasm contains organelles, cytosol, and cytoskeleton. And all three of these general structures must exist in all cells in prokaryotic or eukaryotic organisms. And so here I drew a cell on my own just to show you what is what and what kind of structure pertains to each of these labels. So organelles, we could have the mitochondrion here. We could have, this is a lysosome that protects the cell from viruses and bacteria and other pathogens. Now here we have other organelles like the endoplasmic reticulum. So that's the ER. Now it could be rough ER or just the ER without the ribosomes. We've got all these little dots here I drew. Those are the ribosomes that exist freely. And that's generally the organelles, and all kinds of cells would have different organelles. Like not every cell has a mitochondrion. Not every cell has an endoplasmic reticulum. However, they all have some sort of organelles that will provide function and structure to the cell. Now the cytosol is typically just the medium, the aqueous water solution that contains ions and various organic molecules within the cell. It's also sort of considered as the filling within the cell. Now the cytoskeleton is these little lines that I drew all over here, as you can see. So all these little lines is the cytoskeleton, and the cytoskeleton is a protein-based framework of structures that helps maintain proper shape and plays a key role in cell division and chromosome segregation. When cells divide, the cytoskeleton structure helps them kind of move the chromosomes away from each other in order to separate the cell and produce a new cell generation. So the cytoskeleton is originally was actually thought to be in a specific just to eukaryotic structures like eukaryotic cells, but recently a lot of research has shown that eukaryotic cytoskeletal proteins are also existent in prokaryotes. All right, and next, looking more specifically into the structures and the functions of the cell classification, and we're going to begin with the prokaryotic cell, looking exactly at what they do and what their significant structures are. So let's decipher what prokaryotic cells are. Well, typically they're small. They're very small cells. They're one of the smallest cells that exist in nature, and they're especially much smaller than eukaryotes. I mean, if you compare a typical human cell is about 10 times the diameter and over 8,000 times the volume of an average prokaryotic cell. So looking at how tiny an E. coli bacteria is, like I've shown in the previous example, it is at least, the diameter of it is at least 10 times smaller than the human cell. So you can take that into consideration when we're looking at the cell sizes. You need to know that the prokaryotic cell is much, much smaller on average than the eukaryotic cell. Now, what the shapes of a prokaryotic cell, they could be spherical, they could be rod-like, and they could be spiral. Those are the three typical generalizations of prokaryotic cells. And they contain this structure called a nucleoid. So we're actually going to define all these things, but remember, like we said earlier, that they do not have a nucleus. So they do not have any sort of membrane surrounding their DNA and that prokaryotic chromosome. However, they have this structure called a nucleoid, and I'm going to explain what that is once we label these things. Their DNA is called a prokaryotic chromosome. They typically just have that one chromosome existent. And they still undergo the central dogma of biology. What I mean by that is they still undergo transcription, they undergo translation, and protein synthesis, just like eukaryotic cells do that have a nucleus, and they still do the same transcription translation functions as these prokaryotic cells. And most cells, most prokaryotes, they contain a structure called a cell wall, and I'm going to go over that as well. And some of them may also contain flagella or pili structures that help propel the prokaryotic cell in a water-like medium. So let's label all of these structures that we have on the diagram here just to show a typical prokaryotic cell and the structures it has. So we're going to begin with the most outer part of the cell, and this one is called a capsule. Capsule, like that. And the capsule is typically there to protect the cell from pathogens and other molecules that may damage it, but it functions to decipher what type of bacteria it is. So if this is a bacteria structure like E. coli, it would decipher whether it's a gram-positive or a gram-negative, and the capsule plays a big role in that respect. Now going a little bit deeper into the next layer, here, this structure we have is called the cell wall, and as I've mentioned, that most prokaryotic cells have cell walls, and their main function is to keep the structure of the cell intact and to protect the cell from outside environment. And moving in to the inside, the most inner structure here of this outer lining would be called the plasma membrane. Cell plasma membrane. Plasma membrane. And we've talked that plasma membranes exist on all kinds of cells, including prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So the most inner structure of this outer lining would be the plasma membrane, and then it would be the cell wall, and the capsule would exist on the outside. Now looking at this structure right here, that would be the flagella. And that's the one I've mentioned previously that helps propel the cell in a water-like medium. And same thing happens with the pili. So all these little projections that stick outside would be called the pili. And these pili projections, again, they have the same function as the flagella, is to move the cell in a water-like medium. Looking next at this structure pointing right in the middle of the cell, and it has all these convoluted chains, that's the genetic material of a prokaryotic cell. Now, as you can see, this genetic material is not covered and surrounded by any sort of membrane like it would in a eukaryotic cell. Now, because this is a prokaryotic cell, it does not have a nucleus around it, does not have any sort of membrane around it. So this structure, this convoluted structure of a prokaryotic chromosome is called the nucleoid. Nucleoid. Right? And that's the structure that I mentioned right here. Now, moving on next to these little dots that we have all over the cell, that would be the ribosomes. Oops, ribosome. And next, these little structures right here, they're also kind of looking like the genetic material that's right in the middle with the nucleoid. However, this one would actually be called the plasmid. And plasmid is genetic material that actually exists outside the nucleoid because prokaryotic cells, they do not have a nucleus, and they can have genetic material flowing around in the cytoplasm and in the cytosol. And these two little structures right here are called the plasmid, and they also code for various proteins and various genes in the prokaryotic cell. Next, the last structure I've outlined here is the cytoplasm. So as we said earlier, all components of all types of cells have cytoplasm as their general component, the general filling of the cell inside. And the final thing I wanted to mention about prokaryotic cells is that if you look back into this diagram, it does not have a mitochondrion. So prokaryotic cells do not produce their ATP, mitochondrion. They do not produce their ATP through this structure called the mitochondrion, which is labeled as the powerhouse of the cell in a lot of eukaryotic cells. However, prokaryotic cells don't use mitochondria to produce ATP and to produce chemical energy within their cells. What they actually use is their plasma membrane that performs a lot of vital functions for the bacteria in the archaea group, But besides just simply transporting materials into and out of the cell, like I mentioned earlier, it also contains most of the molecular systems that metabolize food molecules into chemical energy and ATP. So this plasma membrane produces a lot of ATP for the cell. And that's what it uses as its powerhouse, so to speak. But it does not have these structures called the mitochondria just to produce ATP for them. It would have this plasma membrane doing all that work. Now, a lot of prokaryotic cells have different machinery in terms of how they produce ATP. However, in the generalization is that prokaryotic cells use their plasma membrane to do the metabolic functions for the cell. Now we're going to discuss the eukaryotic cell and see how the structures differ from prokaryotic cells and what makes eukaryotic cells so unique. Well, they have a true nucleus, as I've mentioned earlier, and the nucleus also has the structure called a nuclear envelope. Not all eukaryotic cells have nuclear envelopes. However, they do have these structures, these envelopes that are also another double membrane within the nucleus that is a specialized structure because they do not occur in prokaryotic cells. They also have specialized organelles, and we're going to talk about those. They have the endomembrane system, and this includes the ER and the Golgi apparatus. And they also have mitochondria. So as I mentioned earlier, the prokaryotic cells, they do not have mitochondria to produce their ATP. However, a lot of eukaryotic cells do have these specialized structures called mitochondria to produce a lot of their metabolic functions. So let's take a look at these structures through a diagram. So here I have a plant cell. As you can see, the shape of it and how thick this membrane is. And the round shape would be the animal cell. Right, so we can decipher these as plant, animal. And all plant and animal cells are eukaryotic cells. All right, so let's take a look at their structures and how they're similar and in which respects they're different from prokaryotic cells. So first of all, as I've mentioned previously, they have a structure called the nucleus. And then that's the nucleus right here. Now this little another little dot here is called the nucleolus. Nucleolus, and that's typically where a lot of the chromosomes are tightly packed and they're contained within this nucleolus structure. Now what surrounds this nucleolus and what makes the nucleolus is the nuclear envelope. It's a double membrane structure that's within the nucleus that forms these pores, and it's within the nucleus containing the DNA and the chromosomes inside. Next, the plant cell also has a specialized structure called a central vacuole. And the central vacuole is responsible for storage. It's the main function of the central vacuole is to store a lot of the nutrients the plant cell has produced. Now, looking at the energy metabolism of eukaryotic cells and their machinery that metabolizes products. As we've mentioned in prokaryotic cells, they typically use the cell membrane to do that. However, in eukaryotic cells, this occurs through specialized organelles, specialized structures, like the mitochondria. So these two structures here are mitochondria. And in plant cells, they also have these structures called chloroplast. Now, another structure I must mention about plant cells that also occur in prokaryotic cells is the cell wall. So I've labeled it here as this most outer structure because it would be the cell wall and then the cell membrane. But plant cells would have cell walls. Animal cells do not have cell walls. However, cell walls are a structure that would be commonly shared between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. Now, if we're looking at this endomembrane system that I've mentioned previously, let's talk about what that is and what structures it involves. So here we have the endoplasmic reticulum. Endoplasmic reticulum. And typically that would just be called the ER. And all these little dots around the endoplasmic reticulum, it makes this endoplasmic reticulum be called rough endoplasmic reticulum. And rough meaning that it has ribosomes attached to it. Now what this endoplasmic reticulum does is it focuses on packaging and producing proteins that come from translation and transcription within the cell nucleus. Now next, these two are pointing towards the little dots that exist floating all around the cytoplasm, and these would be called the ribosomes, and we've mentioned that they also exist in prokaryotic cells. Next, there are a part of the endomembrane system. We have this apparatus that it's kind of looks like the endoplasmic reticulum. However, it is not attached to the nucleus, so it is outside the nucleus. And this one would be called the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus. And the Golgi apparatus typically packages proteins and shapes them into these 3D and structures in order to form the functional protein that would come out and actually have a function for the cell. Next, these little lines that are all around the cell here, these little lines would be called the microtubules. Microtubules. And microtubules are structures of the cytoskeleton that we've talked earlier about. And microtubules, their main function is to transport nutrients. They can transport various molecules all around the cell. They can transport it from the ER down to the plasma membrane or to other types of organisms. And the microtubules are also used in cell division. Now these dots, these white dots all around the animal cell would also be called lysosome, and we're going to talk a little bit more about lysosomes in the next couple of slides. And another specialized structure that eukaryotic cells have are these barrel-like structures, and they're called centrioles. Centrioles, and they're very critical in cell division, as we will mention in the next couple of slides. Now, if we're considering a further breakdown of animal and plant cells, let's talk about the two different cells and decipher which structures are specific to each one. Now, in terms of animal cells, we've seen this animal cell before. The lysosomes would only exist, only exist on animal cells, not plant cells. Plant cells do not have lysosomes, and that's what deciphers really a animal cell from a plant cell. Now the other structure would be these centrioles that also only exist in animal cells, and as I've mentioned previously, they help the cell in cell division. They actually pull the cytoplasm to each end. They would assemble on each side of the cell and pull the cytoplasm apart, forming two cells and causing cell division to occur. Now, if we're looking at the plant cell and the three specialized structures of a plant cell that would not exist in animals, first, that would be the cell wall, as I've mentioned previously. So cell wall is a specialized eukaryotic structure in only plant cells, not animal cells. Now the next structure that I've mentioned before that only exists in plants but not animals would be the chloroplasts. So chloroplasts They produce energy from light, so they use sunlight in order to produce ATP for the cell, whereas animal cells would use these structures called the mitochondrion to produce ATP for their own cell. Now, the last structure that defines plant cells that does not exist in animal cells would be this large structure called the central vacuole. Central vacuole. And the central vacuole's main function is to provide storage for the cell and to store all of its metabolites and all of its ATP and energy within the central vacuole so that it can be released when the cell actually needs it. So today it concludes this part of the lecture on the types of cells there are in terms of prokaryotic and eukaryotic and their classification. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at viruses, their structures, and their existence in nature.